Shana Tova Umituka Yoter. A good new year, a sweet new year, a better new year. Last night, Russ Grosser taught me that this has been something going around in the Jewish world, a new way of greeting. Just like so many things have changed, this is a new way we greet one another. 15 seconds. The time it takes you to tie your shoe, text a loved one, or sing the Shema. It is also the time a resident of southern or northern Israel has to find shelter during a rocket attack. 15 seconds from the time the siren begins to sound until the explosion. 15 seconds, that is all. Barely enough time to think, let alone to find safety. I learned this the hard way. Back in the summer of 2014, a decade ago, I was part of a 5-day Federation mission to Israel. 5 days, we went in one day, had 3 days there, went out. This was purely business. We would swoop in, meet with officials, hear about the circumstances on the ground, and head out again. That June, 3 Israeli teens, Eyal, Yifrak, Gilad, Shair, and Naftali Frankel, all aged 16 through 19, had been abducted from their homes in the West Bank and brutally murdered. Suddenly, rockets were being launched into the heart of Israel, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and Gaza. Sound familiar? Unfortunately, way too familiar. Our very first trip as a congregation was postponed because of that. In response, Israel launched Operation Protective Edge to both stop the rockets and restore peace. We, the Americans, were there as witnesses. On the third day of our visit, we had an opportunity to leave our hotel in Tel Aviv and head down to Sderot. Now, those of you familiar with Sderot is right on the border of Gaza, and it's the largest city on the border of Gaza. This is where 15 seconds came into play. It's less than 2 miles away. It meant we would only have those 15 seconds in the event of an attack. Much to the chagrin, and definitely against the advice of both of our wives, Rabbi Perry Netter and I, we were the Buffalo contingent, decided to go. It was very funny. Well, not so funny, but when we got down there, both of our wives called us at the same exact time, say, "What are you doing down there?" They had talked to each other. We had to travel by van for the simple reason that you can get off a van a lot quicker than you can off a bus. While inside, one of the instructors actually held out a stopwatch, ticking down the seconds, tick, tick, tick. In that amount of time, we had to collectively scurry out of the van, throw ourselves on the ground. After several tries, we were more or less successful. So we headed out with our hearts pounding like a stopwatch directly from the heart of Israel into the heart of the conflict. Once there, we heard stories from school teachers, students, first responders, political leaders, and residents. We met in various different places. Every place we met, whether a school or immigration center, was a built-in shelter. Over and over, they had the same message. While the rocket attacks were terrifying, what really kept them up at night was something entirely different. It had to do with the sounds they would hear every night as they attempted to fall asleep. Sounds they described over and over again, person to person, like mice burrowing underneath their homes. Sounds they knew to be Hamas with heavy equipment from several miles away, building tunnels underneath the ground. Sounds that meant that Hamas was coming. Even back then, the residents of Sderot had reason to fear this very scenario. It was widely known that they were building tunnels and aimed to attack the residents of southern Israel. At that time, we learned later, it was only luck and Israelis' military might, that foiled those initial plans. When news of the brutal, unprovoked attack came to us in early mornings of October 7th on Simchat Torah last year, I instantly flashed back to those conversations I had in 2014. And I knew two things. One, how right the residents had been. And two, that that day, was only the beginning. What was to follow would be far worse. In rabbinical school, we often talked about something we called the Lachrymose theory of Jewish history. Lachrymose, it's kind of a funny word. It means given to weeping or intensely sad. If sad had a color, lachrymose would be its name. And we love to say this word, to prove ourselves. As rabbinical students, we would, different students would just offer it up in the middle of class as often as we could. It was coined by a Jewish historian, Salo Baron, who in 1928 published an article where he proposed that in order to understand the history of the Jews in any age and place, it was essential first to study what the Jews were doing between the attacks, what they were thinking, writing, creating, selling, buying. Surely, he wrote, it is time to break with the Lachrymose theory in pre-revolutionary woe and to adopt a view more in accord with historic truth. He meant that it wasn't just the attacks, pogroms, and all that. There were other good things as well. So while it was cute for us being ordained in 2004 to use this word over and over again, and we were going into one of the most optimistic periods in all of Jewish history, in 2024, we understand the Lachrymose theory of Jewish history because we are now living in it. October 7th, I don't have to tell you, was the single largest attack on the Jewish world since the Holocaust. I keep telling people that this year has been the hardest year of my Jewish life. This was a pogrom, just like the ones that chased my family, many of yours, to America at the turn of the 20th century. Brutal, bloody, government-led. Over the course of a few hours, 1,139 seniors, women, children, babies were taken from their beds, their streets, their fields, their concert venues by unknown assailants to be beaten and murdered. Worse yet, 250 peaceful Israeli citizens were dragged with their hands tied behind their backs at gunpoint into the tunnels of Gaza. The same tunnels that kept the residents of Sde Road up at night a decade ago. Now, 363 days later, only 101 still remain in captivity. At least a third of those hostages have already died. 363 days later, we are still living in the aftermath of that one day. I also keep telling people, we are still in October 7th. We haven't moved to October 8th. How can you grieve during the time and the year we've had? We have officially entered the Lachrymose theory of Jewish history. The scholar, Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer, who runs the Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, says the reason why October 7th has been so impactful in the Jewish community is not only because of the events themselves, but because of the way those events have shattered several long-standing myths we had about ourselves. Number one, and this is for Israeli society, that Hamas wouldn't be capable of such an attack. Number two, that the liberal order would work to protect Jews. And number three, that Zionism and Israel had solved the Jewish problem. October 7th was not only an attack on the Jewish people, it was an attack on the Jewish psyche. In many ways, we have spent this past year not only lamenting the tremendous loss of life on that day, but our collective loss of faith. There's a reason that three officers now stand guard outside of our synagogue doors. We no longer feel safe inside of them. How many of you this year have thought twice about wearing something, a t-shirt, a hat, a necklace that identifies you as Jewish? Raise your hand if that's the case. How many of you have thought twice about attending a Jewish-run event? How many of you have thought twice about entering a Jewish space? This is what October 7th has taken from us. And yet, that's not been our only response. For some of us, October 7th gave us a reason and the need to bear our Judaism more openly. For those of you this is the case, let me ask a completely different set of questions, and I noticed this on lots of people today. How many of you have started wearing things that identify you as part of the Jewish community? How many of you have deliberately attended more Jewish events than you would have in the past? How many of you are here today, at least in part, because of October 7th? I'm not here to judge your responses, just name them. We balance our fear, our yirah, with our faith, our emunah. Take a moment to think back to that fateful Saturday morning in early October. How many of you remember exactly where you were when you heard the news? How many of you will never forget where you were when you heard the news? Events like Pearl Harbor, Kennedy assassination, 9/11, October 7th, shape us as human beings. All these years later, I've come to realize that most of my work in interfaith spaces has been formed because I was a rabbi when September 11th happened. I was in rabbinical school. 10/7, October 7th, has created just as much a seismic shift within the Jewish community, an absolute crater that we have not even begun to process, let alone understand. They just had a report on the news about hurricanes. Usually like we just had this horrendous one, Helene. I don't know if you saw this. I read in the Buffalo News this morning. And they said that, yes, they said a couple dozen people had died, but actually the result of hurricanes are thousands of people, a 6%. And that the same because of all the changes, not directly killed by the hurricane, but by everything in it. It's the same thing when you have seismic events like October 7th. In 2 decades of being a rabbi, I've never had as many conversations about people's Jewish identities than I have this year. I have seen people come out of the woodwork who have never walked into a synagogue in their lives, but who have some sort of Jewish family or some semblance of a Jewish identity, suddenly feel a need to talk to me. I've seen active members with clear Jewish identities who have attended services and been part of the community for years, now completely unsure what to think or what to feel. I've heard horror stories from workplaces, college campuses, political venues, seniors in high school applying to colleges based on whether they would feel safe as Jews, people leaving jobs that they loved or starting new ones as well. This hasn't just happened once, twice, but again and again and again and again and again. Sometimes as much as once a week. The news, as we see, has become unbearable. For many of us, being Jewish has made us feel angry, scared, isolated, and alone. We have always been a small minority in America and an even smaller one in the larger world, less than 0.02%. Now we have been made to feel like one. Post-October 7th has been a time where we both hide our Magen Davids and bear them openly, bravely share our faith and shelter in silence, affirm our identities and run away from them. Conflicting emotions, circles that cannot be squared. As a rabbi, I wish I had answers for you, but I have just as many questions as the rest of you. The speed of change has left my head spinning. The speed of change has left all of our heads spinning. 15 seconds, the time it takes you to tie your shoe, text a loved one, sing the Shema. A short amount of time that can feel like an eternity. 15 seconds is all it took for the news of October 7th to sink in last year. 15 seconds was all that it took to change. On Rosh Hashanah, we don't count seconds with a stopwatch. We count them with verses of the Torah. The 2 primary stories that we read on Rosh Hashanah from the book of Genesis, the banishment of Hagar and the binding of Isaac, take place in the matter of of second Torah time. The banishment of Hagar, 21 verses. The binding of Isaac, 19. In each of them, the clock ticks as the fate of our first family hangs in the balance. No moment is more intense. All these years later, no matter how many times we read it, then that moment where Abraham raises the knife as if to go down to Isaac's neck. On that altar atop that unknown mountain, the fate of all of our people, indeed all of monotheism, was in jeopardy. No matter how many times I read it, Genesis 22, verse 10, I still feel my heart racing. And Abraham stretched out his hand and took his knife to slay his son. What will Abraham decide? We know. But it still comes to us. How will Isaac react? Where will God be? Tick, tick, tick. In the end, disaster is averted, but the pain of that moment hovers over us as if we were Isaac, bound, afraid, helpless, a collective PTSD that has lasted to this day. Rosh Hashanah freezes us in that moment, asks us to consider what if the worst happens, so that when it does, we have at least considered that possibility. 363 days ago, the worst did happen. This coming Monday marks the 1-year anniversary of October 7th. We arrive at this knowing that sirens to continue to go off on a nightly basis. The residents of southern Israel and northern Israel continue to run to safety or to be in shelter. And the night of terrors I learned out about a decade ago about mice burrowing and armies emerging continues to keep the residents of southern and northern Israel up at night. Palestinian and Jewish children continue to cry out in pain. The brokenness of our world continues. We can't move back. October 6th is not a possibility. We can only move forward. The question to all of us is, how will we use our 15 seconds? Will we use it to attack one another, rage against the world, or will we use it to text our loved ones, to hold them, to make sure everything is okay? I'm going to bring up our shofar blowers. Whoever has a shofar here, invite everyone to rise. We're going to listen to a slightly longer tikiyah, lasting approximately 15 seconds. Use that time to consider what you would do, to look around at our community, to share love and compassion that we all need in this moment. Use that time to reflect on the horrors and begin to consider the possibility of this coming year to come. Together we say tikiyah. Tikiyah! In spite of everything, I wish you, as I always do, a Shana Tova Umituka, a Shana Tova Umituka Yoter, a sweet, a healthy, a better, and a happy new year. You may be seated.